Welcome to the 2021 edition of the Sustaining Our World Lecture Series in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences in the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. My name is Dan Brown, and I'm director of the school. I'll be serving as your host for this evening's event, which is co-sponsored with the PRISM program, which stands for Pedagogy and Research on Race, Identity, Social Justice, and Meaning, and is an educational development initiative at the University of Washington designed to foster diverse careers in STEM. Before we get started here in Seattle, the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. For tonight's lecture, we're honored to host Dr. Beronda L. Montgomery, a writer, science communicator, and Michigan State University Foundation professor in the departments of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and of Microbiology and Molecular Genetics. She's a member of the MSU DOE Plant Research Laboratory, and her research group investigates how photosynthetic organisms adapt to changes in their environment. Her scholarship extends beyond biology and into studying mentorship and faculty development to develop evidence-based strategies to foster equity and inclusion in academia. Dr. Montgomery served as an assistant provost for faculty development from 2016 to 2020 at MSU, with responsibility for supporting all faculty and academic staff in the areas of research, scholarship, and creative activities. Since fall of 2020, she serves as the interim assistant vice president for research and innovation at MSU. We in CEFS first heard about Dr. Montgomery's work when a few of us participated in a workshop she led that was hosted by the PRISM program last year. At that time, she mentioned she was working on a new book that would be published this month. The book is called Lessons from Plants, about how plant behavior and adaptation offer valuable insights for human thriving. Assistant Director Monica Moskal and I independently came to the great idea of encouraging her to include our annual lecture in her book launch tour. We're excited that she accepted our invitation and to have her here with us now. The book has arrived, and I'm finding it a beautifully written reflection on the marvels and complexities of life itself, and a wonderful interpretation of the implications of diversity and adaptation in plant life for our own. The PRISM program is offering free copies of the book through a giveaway available on their website. The link should appear in the comments section below. Also, if you have questions during or after the talk, please feel free to type them into the comments section below the video, and we'll take some time at the end of our lecture for questions and answers. Now, welcome, Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that gracious introduction. And I want to thank you and Monica for thinking to ask me to participate. I also want to thank the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, the College of the Environment, and I'd also like to thank TK Francis and PRISM for co-sponsoring this event. It's an absolute thrill for me to have a chance to come back to the University of Washington community and discuss this new book, which I'm super excited about, and to tell you a little bit tonight about how I think about lessons from plants, an insight that I've drawn and I hope can inspire you as well to thrive as humans. So I'm really thrilled to be here for this 2021 Sustaining Our World lecture. So I start here with this picture because this is a picture that's fascinated me for the past 25 years or so. And it is at the base of the kinds of questions that I ask about plants. Although tonight I'm going to talk more about what I've learned from plants, although anyone who knows me will tell you I can go on at length or ad nauseum, depending on who you ask about my interest in plants. I saw this picture during the first week of graduate school and was highly impressed by what the professor who showed this picture described about the fascination here. So for all practical purposes, these are identical twins. They have identical genetics, and they've been exposed to almost identical environments. They've had the same amount of water, been exposed to the same amount of humidity, the same temperature, had access to the same nutrients. And basically, there's a difference in one critical factor between these two organisms. All things being almost equal, the identical seed that germinates in the dark has a short lifespan. It grows very tall and thin, but remains white to yellow because it's unable to produce sugars for itself. So its life is limited to the energy that was gifted lovingly to it in the seed from the mother plant. Whereas only one critical factor being different, access to light, this seedling, which has identical genetics, has been able to establish itself as a green and healthy plant that we're used to seeing. And the difference here is that this green plant is now self-sustaining. It's able to use sunlight and simple compounds like carbon dioxide and water to drive the production of sugars through the photosynthetic process. And so I was fascinated by the fact that all things being almost equal, a single factor could change what these plants look like, what they're capable of, and what the intended outcomes would be, either one of limited success or one of lifelong success. And I was fascinated with this enough that I've spent, as I said, over a couple of decades really trying to understand the biological and biochemical processes by which the plants accomplish this. But as I said, tonight, I'm going to talk about the ways in which this very same picture has really stimulated me to spend a significant amount of time thinking about what I can learn from these organisms about being successfully on the planet Earth. So although that prior picture was very photogenic and those were bean seedlings, I spend most of my life working on this very small plant, which is Arabidopsis. It's a cress plant. It's known for most of us as a weed. You've probably seen a version of it growing in the crack of the sidewalk, or I saw some growing very naughtily in my asphalt. But these are very small plants that have a very similar response, where in the dark, all things being equal, they actually spend a lot of time elongating the stem and very little time developing leaves that we're used to. And that's because in the dark, in a natural context, a plant in the dark would be a seed that germinates in the soil. And the very first goal for a seed that's germinated in the soil is to get out of darkness and into the light so that it can use light for photosynthesis to become independent. So in this context, there are molecular decisions that are made by the plant to put all of its energy in elongating in a rapid search for light. By comparison, plants that are grown in a light environment spend very little energy to elongate the stem. In fact, they actually inhibit putting any energy into the stem, and instead use their energy to make leaves, which are the equivalent of solar panels that allow them again to use sunlight for the production of energy. These kinds of behavioral adaptations are driven by the energy budget. So plants, much like most humans, unless you're Oprah Winfrey or Bill Gates or someone, we have a monthly budget that we can use for all of the activities and behaviors that we need to conduct. Plants similarly have an energy budget, and given that energy budget, they need to make decisions about the most important behavior, prioritized behavior. In the dark, again, that prioritization goes to elongation in the search for light, where in the light, that energy goes into establishing itself to use light energy to make its own energy. So I've been very fascinated by that, as I said, in terms of the biology of it, but I've also been fascinated by how much this demonstrates for us that environment matters, and how it demonstrates that two biological organisms with equal aptitude can have different outcomes depending on the environment. And that's really impressed a lot on me for the ways in which we often think about humans based upon what individual characteristics they show up with, and don't spend as much time asking about how much the environment matters. So one of the most impressive and long-lasting lessons from plants that I've had is really understanding the importance and the interplay between individual organisms and the environments in which they're in, and how that positions one organism or another that really show up with equal aptitude for completely different outcomes. So I really, we continue in my lab even to this day to study what we can learn about plants, but I have also spent a lot of time reflecting on what we can learn from plants. And part of this is really driven by my guiding life principle of reciprocity, where I've gotten a lot from learning about plants in terms of career access, but also what is my duty to return some knowledge about what I've learned. It's also arisen from an invitation for wanting to include my family and friends, none of whom are biologists, into my enthusiasm for what I do, and sometimes to provide a justification for them as to why my life is completely consumed with understanding these particular organisms. So part of the ways in which I first moved into not only reflecting on these lessons for plants for myself, but started to have a greater scholarly interest in them was when I actually put my boots on the ground and started to lead a lab. So when I showed up at Michigan State in 2004 to set up my lab, there were three major things that I had to accomplish rather quickly. One of those was filling up the empty space with equipment and supplies to conduct experiments. I found this quite fascinating because that's virtually shopping, lots of catalogs and ordering and unpacking. The second thing was to identify the questions that we would prioritize. And I love, the reason I'm a scientist, that I love the possibility of being creative, to think up interesting questions, to think up the hypotheses and experiments that will allow me to investigate those. So I was very excited about that as well, had hundreds of questions over time. The third thing was that I needed to fill the space with people. And it's once I started to think about that and having responsibility for collaborating with students and trainees that I really realized that in many ways I wasn't clear or had not been formally prepared to mentor and lead these students. And as I started to think about the ways that I had been mentored very differently by different people and still had success on the other end of that. So I didn't have any one model of what mentoring looked like. And many of us, if we've been mentored in a very similar way, we assume that that's the way mentoring must occur to have success. So as I started to really watch what was happening with students, in not always in my group, but in other groups as well, I really started to understand the ways in which we as plant biologists were not taking the knowledge that we had in terms of understanding the severe and very large impact that the environment has on organisms, to think about the ways in which we had responsibility for mentoring and academic leadership. So I started myself to do some work on that, and then also moved into asking questions about how I could further conversations about that in community. In the work that I was doing myself, I really did go back to this initial image and understand how important it was to really look at the environmental impact on the students and colleagues that I had responsibility and certainly an opportunity to engage with in community. And so I really did spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which we as scientists and also humans engage with plants, and asking questions about how we could really get ourselves to look at the organisms, other individuals that we have an opportunity to interact with, and ask questions about how the environment was either positioned to support them or not. And I did write a paper a number of years ago that drew out several different lessons that we could use from plants in terms of trying to promote possibility as opposed to looking at individual deficits. And a lot of this work, as I said, was first stimulated by my own interest in being the best mentor and leader that I could. But I realized that even beyond plants, that I could move to asking the similar questions that I ask about plants. How does the environment impact their ability to grow, their ability to thrive? And I could ask similar questions about people. And so really, I started to think more deeply about the interactions and relationships that humans have with plants. And humans really have awe-inspiring relationships with plants, whereby most humans, if they have plants in their environment, there is a default expectation that the plant should grow. And in fact, if we see a plant that looks like this particular plant, which is wilted relative to a healthy version, when we see a plant that looks like this, we as humans generally start to ask questions about, what does this plant need? Does this plant need some water? Or is it wilting because it's too hot or too cold? We ask a number of questions about the environment. And often we will also ask if we have the knowledge to actually be a good caretaker for this particular plant. Similarly, many humans, particularly those who are good gardeners, if they look at a plant like this one that's on the right with the yellow leaves, the questions that they often will start to ask themselves is, in fact, I had a conversation earlier today and people responded, had this plant not had enough water? Was it overwatered? Did it need Miracle-Gro or access to nutrients? Was it in a pot that it no longer had room for its roots to grow and thrive? And so the real point that I want to focus on is that humans expect that plants should grow and thrive. And when they're not growing or thriving, they ask questions about the environment. Few humans would look at this plant and say that this plant is incapable of greening. They will assume that there's something missing in the environment that has supported a natural ability of these plants to green. And likewise, they will assume that this plant is missing something that allows it to stand up to be turgid and well watered. And so I've really been impressed that frequently when we discuss deficits in our abilities to support each other's in community, we will often default to the fact that the person that we're trying to help is incapable of learning to the degrees that we want, that they're incapable of showing the outcomes that we hope. And it occurred to me that frequently when we talk about this and we try to say to people that there's a better way to do it, they say, well, that's so difficult. And so one of the things that's been really inspiring to me is that we have this capability. We have this capability to expect that plants in our environment should grow. I can't even have enough time tonight to tell you how pet lovers believe that pets that are in their home should be healthy, they should be happy, and they should be whole. And if there's any departure from that, there's investments of money and time, new food and new veterinarians. And so we have these innate abilities. And my argument has become that we limit ourselves from seeing the potential of growth for others in our environment in the same way that would lead us to have deep and consistent questions about the environment that's there to support them. And so really one of the things that I have really focused a lot on is the fact that when an organism does not fare well in its environment, we generally assess, particularly for plants and pets, as I've said, both individual factors about whether there's something wrong with the particular individual, but we equally ask questions about the environment. And sometimes, particularly for plants, we usually ask questions about the environment and caretaking abilities first. And it's one of our last resorts to assume that the plant has a defect in its ability to grow. And so I was really impressed that the ways in which we allow ourselves to assess both individual factors about an organism and environmental contributors that can result in either an impaired fitness or the ability to thrive says that we have the ability to apply this beyond plants, beyond pets, and that it is potentially a powerful tool that can transform our environments, particularly those environments where we have said we want to have greater equity. Part of that is expecting that everyone who shows up in the space has a capacity to grow, and that we need to have a commitment to ensure that the environment has everything that that particular individual needs to support their success. So I've really been enriched by the fact that when I think about the relationships that I as a plant biologist have in terms of plants, but also any human usually has with plants, we engage with them. We try to enrich their lives and we try to empower them to grow. And I think that if we could take these principles of engaging, enriching, and empowering into our relationships with each other, that we could really have transformed communities, transformed educational spaces, and transformed personal lives. And so I have talked even more about this. I had a chance to talk about how I really have looked at as plants as teachers in terms of having a lot to show us about how important it is to understand how the environment and the individual interact. But I've also understood even broader than that for plants to serve as powerful witnesses to our lives and history. And so this particular article that I wrote in American Scientist late last year, I believe it was, came from a trip that I took with my sister and my son. We often travel together. And when we travel together, we have a tradition that each person chooses an activity that's meaningful to them. Mine usually involves visiting a botanical garden, or it depends on if my son is there, a spa, but it's something like that. Those two, my sister and my son, they scheme against me and they want to go to expensive restaurants or historical cultural sites. And at this particular trip, we were in South Carolina and they wanted to visit a plantation. I had a visceral reaction to not wanting to visit a plantation, but because we honor each other's choices, I went. And that particular day, we visited the McLeod plantation right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And as we were visiting the land, it was heavy to think about the historical lives of enslaved people, my enslaved ancestors who had been there toiling and under those conditions. And we entered the cabins that would have housed the enslaved people, and they felt small and felt heavy. But as we were walking across the grounds, one of the tour guides pointed out a tree, a 600-year-old tree. And my sister and son walked on around the land, but I was really drawn to this tree and drawn to my understanding as a plant biologist that carbon dioxide that we breathe is taken up by plants, and that is incorporated into sugars through the process of photosynthesis. Those sugars get incorporated into structures such as leaves that come and go annually, but also into the wood. And so the very breath of people is incorporated into long-living plants. And so then I became aware that standing in the presence of that tree, I was able to stand in the presence of ancestors, that the tree stood as a witness to my ancestors. And also I found hope, even in the midst of what could have been a very heavy moment at the plantation, to understand that as the descendant of enslaved people, as the descendant of parents who were raised in the segregated South under Jim Crow, that I stood there free will on the land, able to experience that and honor. And so I think that plants can serve as teachers, but we also have to acknowledge them as witnesses of our experiences, as witnesses of historical experiences. And so other kinds of experiences that have really been impactful for me in terms of plants are thinking about the importance of the way that plants often grow better in diverse communities than they do in single composition communities. So in agriculture, there's something known as monoculture. We do a lot of monoculture in the US where we grow only fields of corn, only fields of a single type of plant. And some more traditional practices, including indigenous planting practices in the US and abroad, involve polyculture, or growing plants from different backgrounds together with the understanding that they have greater success together because of the complementary contributions that they bring to community than they do growing in isolation. And one of the very commonly known or commonly shared practices is the three sisters. I've heard about this in many cases, but one of the most impactful tellings that I was exposed to was in a talk by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a plant ecologist and an author herself. She's the author of the best-selling Braiding Sweetgrass, also the author of Gathering Moss. And the three sisters are generally corn, bean, and squash that are grown together. And what we know about these three sisters is that co-planting of them draws on their complementary strengths. Again, with the complementary strengths resulting in these diverse plants growing better together than they do in homophily. And so as we know that they grow more robustly together, we know specifically that the individual complementary strengths that they bring to this relationship. Corn is the first sister. She grows tall and provides a vertical support for the beans that would otherwise grow along the ground. And so the beans, in collaboration with bacteria that are housed within their roots, are able to make a nitrogen-based fertilizer that supports the growth of itself, but in excess also supports the first sister corn, who has provided a physical support. The third sister is squash, which grows low to the ground and inhibits growth of weeds and maintains the soil moisture. So this promotes the growth of the other two sisters. The squash, in return, gets a little bit of shade from the corn, which is important for its growth, but it also gets some of the excess fertilizer. So these three sisters each have complementary roles. And even though it's long been known from indigenous people that this is a very productive pairing of plants, scientists later did show that using any number of scientific measures of growth and productivity, that these plants indeed grow more robustly together. And there are other pairings of plants in polyculture across the world, which really does demonstrate the power of diversity, the importance of each of us coming to the table with our greatest unique strengths and drawing upon those complementary strengths to make a stronger, more productive community. And so I was very impressed by this personally as a professor. Three of the goals of my job are to teach, do research, and to do service. And as a professor, you will hear many of us recognize that those feel like three areas that are in constant competition for our time, in constant competition for our resources and attention. And so really rather early in my career, reflecting on this polyculture and particularly the three sisters as one powerful example and analogy, I began to think of my career and to ask, how could I position the three expectations of me as three sisters so that I could see complementarity between research and teaching, whether that was bringing ideas from my research into my teaching experiences, where I could see complementation between research and service. And so service for me has often been actively working to promote the inclusion of underrepresented groups, Black and Brown women and others, into science. And so for me, the integration between research and service was often doing research in collaboration with professors who were from minority serving institutions. And so it became really powerful for me to think about this. And even beyond thinking about it in faculty development, I talk about this in the book Lesson from Plants, and I've also thought about that in my personal life. And if two of my sisters are being a mother and one of them is self-care, then taking a long walk with my son becomes an opportunity to both spend very good time with him, but also meet the need for physical engagement. And so really, I think that thinking about the three sisters, I often have thought about how we can think of this as an ecosystem of support, whether it's bringing support across different domains of a career, or whether it's thinking about different individuals in a community as the individual three sisters. And particularly, I've thought about this as compared to the ways in which we often think about life, particularly in the US, although it is a global condition for many humans. And that's where we prize individual success over a community and an ecosystem. In my life, that's the person who discovers something first gets all the glory and the grant dollars, as opposed to asking, could we have collaborated and gotten there quicker, or maybe even gotten a bit farther? And so I think about, who are the three sisters in different domains of life? How do I understand those three sisters in terms of their complementarity? And how do I promote that understanding and engagement across those three to really have the same outcome, where there's greater success in diversity than there is in isolation? And so I think about the university, administration, faculty, and staff should be three sisters, where we think about how those work collectively together, as opposed to in competition for resources and prestige. I've thought about, as I said, teaching, research, and service, but also in community. How do I think about self-neighbor community or self-neighbor and nation as three sisters, as a complementarity, as opposed to just thinking about this kind of individual success and individual obsession that we often have? And so beyond these papers that I've written, the paper about lessons from mentoring on plants, and also this using the three sisters as a powerful analogy for thinking about integrated faculty development, as you've heard, I did expand beyond that and write this book, Lessons from Plants, where I was able to explore this beyond my own kind of focus on the professional, beyond the uses of mentoring and leadership, but to ask some bigger questions about what lessons plants have for us in terms of thriving as humans, both in and of ourselves, but also our role in the community. And so for me, self is always bilateral. It's self as an individual, but self as community. And how do we really think about what we can learn? I think that this has been really critical for me, because certainly I love plants as a plant biologist, but I think about it from the human perspective, that so frequently we think about how plants serve us, how they beautify our homes and gardens, how they serve as our food. And it's really quite interesting to me to really try to step back and again, engage plants from this life principle I have of reciprocity. And really, in the thinking about that deeply, it became really clear to me that plants will be just fine if we disappear. But if plants disappear, our life is virtually over. And so there really seemed to me to be a responsibility to ask, how can we be more aware of plants? Both what we can give to sustain the ecosystem for them, but also what we can learn from them as powerful teachers about how to be in the world. And so really, I've talked to you about some lessons that I had prior to this book. I talked about this book, but the release of this book has also given me some really interesting opportunities to write some short pieces and to ask myself, beyond this book on lessons from plants, what lessons remain for my own learning? And for me, I've tried to think about this continually in the two major domains of my life, lessons that I have for the professional, and also what lessons are there for me in terms of continuing as an individual person, as a member of my family, as a member of my larger community and beyond. So I start with this one, which was just released. Maybe this was yesterday. It's been a long stretch of days since the book release. But I was invited to think about the ways in which Lessons for Plants have personally served for me as powerful mentors and teachers in terms of how I construct my own space for which I have responsibility as advisor and mentor, and also to ask if there are larger lessons for those of us who also serve in a capacity where we have some influence over the community, and how we could then nurture a thriving scientific community as we look to the natural world for ideas. And so I have reflected on how I focus mostly on plants today. In my lab, we also study bacteria, and there are beautiful lessons from microbes as well. That really give us some insights in how to be in the world. But one of the questions that we ask routinely in my lab, again, is how the environment and the dynamics of the environment interact with individuals and how they're able to perceive that and translate that into behaviors that promote their survival and reproduction. And so, one of the things that's been really interesting to me, as I said, is the ways in which my community of origin as a Black woman raised in the South was very communal. There were often families eating together, families playing together, to move into the academy where you really are encouraged to keep your head down and focus on yourself. And part of that has really my community of origin, my kind of default practices of promoting community really led me to think differently about how I wanted to establish my lab, together with the knowledge that I have gained from plants about how important it is to pay attention to the environment and to really to see myself as a steward of the environment, to ask questions about whether the environment that I'm promoting, that I'm helping translate, that I'm establishing has everything that's needed to promote the success of the diverse individuals who show up in my space. And so not everybody who comes into my space shares the properties that I share, but how do we really set up a space that we're paying attention to the environment? And so in my lab, I talk about in this piece, how it's been very important for me to understand what the individual needs are of individuals whom I have the privilege to work with, collaborate with, and mentor, and to ask questions about how I'm helping them understand what are the best paths for success. Frequently, we assume that the best path for success is the one that we've walked. And so often our mentoring and leadership advice will come through the lens of, I did a certain thing. If you want to be successful, you should do a certain thing. Or the people who came before me did a certain thing, and so you should do that. Well, it became pretty clear to me that that wasn't going to work for me as an individual. I was the first Black woman hired in my department, probably my college. And so there was no one who looked like me who shared a similar background who had gone before me. And that's not to assume that the advice that was given didn't have any relevance, but it also wasn't completely relevant. And so I really tried to take that into the ways I also interact with the students and others who I have an opportunity to work with, to ask, what do you need? And so frequently, the ways that that is best translated is that I don't tell them what they need to do. I try to give them an underlying room to understand why they need to do a certain thing. And so some professors will say you need to work a certain number of hours a week. And that's because they may need to work that number of hours a week to get the certain things that they need to get done. So what I say is you need to be very clear about what you need to accomplish in a particular time, and then ask yourself how you're going to structure your life to get that done and honor the other values that you have, whatever those values are. And so I think we personally have a lot of conversations about why we need to do a certain thing. And then we may arrive at many different whats that would allow each of us to get to a particular end. In addition, I've had a lot of opportunities to reflect on plants and what they can teach me in the personal. And one piece that I was really honored to write was for Elle magazine, about how plants have really been a beacon of hope for me during the pandemic. So the pandemic has been quite a challenge for me and for others, I'm sure. The pandemic has been a challenge because I was physically grounded. I used to be moving about the country and the world much more. And in March, like the rest of us, I was grounded in my home. But prior to March, in October of 2019, my father had passed away after having a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. And a few weeks later, he passed away. So at the end of October and November, I was in a very grief-stricken state. I I think the biggest dad's girl on the planet. And so it was really, really tough. And I went into a period for a while of just being with family and grieving. But before the pandemic, at the end of the year, I knew that my dad would want me to get back out there, get back into my work, get back out on the road. But before that, in the middle of my grief, I was planting some bulbs, some tulip bulbs in the fall. Being a plant biologist, I knew I had to get them in the ground before the ground was frozen. The bulbs need to root, and I needed the ground to be soft enough to plant. So I planted the bulbs in the middle of grief and then went back about my business of trying to get back to life and travel and paid no attention to the bulbs. I really just got back out there. In fact, one of the last trips I had was to Seattle for a meeting. And then I was grounded in March. And so I sat in my home struggling for a while, trying to get a new rhythm to life, because I realized at that point that my greatest love, writing, the rhythm was driven by my life. It was driven by being on a plane from Michigan to California and having several hours. I wrote beautifully in the airport lounges. And so I was trying to reestablish a new life in the middle of a pandemic, afraid of what the pandemic meant. And I think all of us had fears of where this was going to take us. And so in the middle of still dealing with grief and still really asking a lot of questions about how the pandemic was impacting me, one day leaving the home, I saw the leaves of the tulips emerging. And as I really started to watch those tulips over the next days and week, it really was impressed upon me, the thing that's below the article title here, that these plants' undeterred maturation was a reminder that spring, indeed, life itself was moving on. So even as I was in this first spring with the loss of my father, but the emergence of something new that was scary and really struggling to have hope, those plants really started to bring hope to me as an individual. And in the spaces that I frequent online, in social media spaces, in the news, I also saw that plants were serving as a beacon of hope and wonder for others. So I saw countless pictures online of people regrowing the scallions and green onions in their home and being fascinated by how they would grow so vigorously. I saw people using kitchen scraps of lettuce to see that the leaves would grow back. There's an entire robust community of plant people on Instagram. And so even in the midst of the struggles from the pandemic, the struggles from the grief of losing my father, and also dealing with America having a new, I would call it awareness rather than awakening about the impacts of anti-Black racism, plants started to bring hope for me, and I saw them bringing hope and wonder for others. And so while I was really thrilled to be able to write this article and honor the role that my father had had in my life and his love and commitment for vegetable gardening, the tulips really were a very strong kind of beacon of hope for me, that even when things are challenging, sometimes we have to pursue our purpose. And these tulips were single-mindedly pursuing their purpose, even as the world was changing around them, both my personal world, but our global world in the face of a pandemic. And so these bulbs really were reminding me that despite the challenges of the loss of life for me personally, and for all of us globally, the hundreds of thousands of Americans and many, many more across the globe, that plant life was tracking on. And while there are days that any of us could get lost in the global grief, or I could get lost in the personal grief, these plants really served a very powerful beacon of hope for me and for others. And so there've just been so many ways across my life that plants have served as inspiration scientifically, served as inspiration professionally in terms of crafting a professional life, served as inspiration for the mentor that I would like to be, and the mentor that I hope we can have collectively in terms of seeing the potential, expecting growth, not focusing on deficits, but really asking what our role is as a member of the community, as a steward of the community, to provide first an expectation of growth and hope, and then to work actively to contribute to the environment to help promote and sustain hope. And so really, you know, I want to, as I'm drawing towards the end of the comments that I want to share today, you know, I personally have been deeply impacted by plants from a very technical biochemical perspective, from a personal perspective, even as early as watching my mom with her beautiful green thumb, my dad, a beautiful vegetable garden, but then going away from them for many years and thinking I would pursue something else, but coming back to this career where I've had the great opportunity to look into the very minor details of plants. And though that served me well professionally, it served me better as a citizen of the world to really ask, what do our relations, what do other organisms on the earth have to show us? What witness do they have to share with us to really inspire us to rise to our highest selves, both as individuals, but also our highest collective self? And so one of the questions I really want to ask as I was producing this book, as I continue to have opportunities to talk about it and write more about plants in the future, are what lessons are there for your learning? And beyond plants, I think that in many cases, whatever our profession is, we often leave so much knowledge from our profession on our desk, in our research laboratories, in papers we write, in books. And I really implore us to ask whether the choices we've made in terms of our career are opportunities for us to learn more about the world, not just for the sake of learning, not just for the sake of knowledge, not just for the pursuit of prestige, but are these opportunities, are these invitations from the universe for us to ask what lessons there are for us to really be our most productive selves, but to also cultivate our complementary strengths that we might have to offer as one of the sisters in a collaborative collection. So I will end there. And be very happy to answer any questions or have any conversation that these comments might have stimulated.
Thank you so much, Beronda. The comments that we're getting are expressing a deep gratitude for the reflections that you're offering here, a love for the beauty in the book itself, and the thoughts that you're sharing, and for you as a person and representing and presenting yourself and giving yourself in these remarks. So just reflect that in the comments here. And we did get a number of questions that I want to reflect from the folks who are listening here. One question came in the section you were talking about the Three Sisters plants and how they together form a community that is mutually self-supportive. I think it's fascinating that they're self-supporting of each other and of human sustenance.
Yes.
Taken together, they provide the amino acids that we need. That's sort of a separate comment. My own editorial question comes here. Have they co-evolved together with co-evolved with human caretaking? Was that sort of a co-evolution that came with the cultivation or prior to the cultivation or both?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, it's difficult to answer specific questions about coevolution when it includes human agriculture, right? Because a lot of the choices we make about taking the seed from the corn that was that we like the flavor of, that we like sweetness, drives evolution. And so there is this correlation between human selection and a coevolution. There's certainly a coevolution between some parts of the system. So the bacteria and the beans have co-evolved in terms of their abilities to work well together. And so in some ways, we talk about them as three sisters, but the bacteria is like, it's kind of a stepsister because it doesn't get its full due, right? And so there's certainly some coevolution of parts of the system impacted by human intervention and human kind of preference as well.
So we have a couple of comments from the first Black female forester at the USDA Forest Service, a graduate of our program. One question is, today there are only 6
female
foresters, and how do we change that, please, is the first question. A second question that she has is that she teaches math and science as a volunteer in 3 elementary schools. How do we support underserved and underprivileged students being able to spend time in nature when their parents can't help?
Yes, those are both great questions. So I'll start with the limited number of Black foresters and how do we change that. Part of one of the lessons that I talk about in the book is succession, succession that happens when after there's been a forest fire or a volcano or something like Chernobyl, we see systems come back, and we often see a different composition that was there before. And so I talk about succession in terms of kind of leadership, but there's also a powerful lesson there in terms of building diversity. And part of the problem that we have is that we know stable ecosystems, it's hard to change the composition. There has to be sometimes an intentional intervention. If you want to change the composition of plants and animals in a stable ecosystem, in the absence of some kind of natural disaster, there has to be intentional intervention. And we often resist the idea that we need intentional intervention, and that we focus on just getting more people in the pipeline, and that's certainly important. But there's some really powerful work that came out. The authors whose name I remember right now is Kenneth Gibbs, and he did some collaborative work actually modeling what it would take to change the face of medical school faculty diversity over one generation. And there were some clear numbers about what we need to do. We need to commit to hiring certain people if we really want to see that diversity. Some people bristle at that because it sounds like forms of affirmative action that they don't want to commit to. But I go back to biology, and we know that if we want to change the composition in a lifetime, we have to have intentional intervention. In terms of the second part of the question about how do we help promote engagement of students and young people from underrepresented groups in nature, particularly, I did hear the part when their parents don't have time for it. So I think one of the things I love to say is that all kids love nature. And so a lot of times it is about having access and having time. And I think that it's a little bit harder now in the way that we structure our lives. But I grew up in a time when boys and girls clubs were really quite active. After school programs were quite active. And I do think that we know that those things still matter. The question is whether we actually have programs in them that promote time in nature. So I think we actually have to understand the importance of time in nature for all kids and how it is linked to or not later access to certain careers in science, forestry, and other kinds of things. And if we know that those things are important, we have to start supporting those activities. And part of it is that we have to finance them, right? And so we have to have greater economic support. And also, sometimes it is community-based. I was also a big sister when I was in undergrad, and that was a time where I took my little sister to walk in the woods. And so I think we have to prioritize time in nature for those structures like Boys and Girls Club, Big Sister, Little Sister programs, and after-school programs where we know kids are whose parents do need some assistance in terms of childcare.
Great. We have a bit of a more personal question here. The question is, who is in your personal Three Sisters collective?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have several, but the one that's the strongest in my Three Sisters personal, then I'll talk about general characteristics. In my Three Sisters is one of my biological sisters who also happens to be my best friend. And then another long-term friend who I've had for about 20 years. And they are in my Three Sisters for some general principles that I find for Three Sisters. So I do have some professional Three Sisters. I have some Three Sisters who are my people who we do physical activity with. But in my Three Sisters usually is someone who I look up to, who I have something to aspire to. And then there's someone who I feel I have something to offer. I think best we need to be in a places where we both have aspirations that we can go towards, but we also thrive when we're able to have the confidence and motivation of contributing to someone else. And that can be in any number of ways. But I do think that's important. The other way that I think about it is I always have to have someone in my Three Sisters, and this happens to be my biological sister, who tells you the truth even when you don't want to hear it. And that's a different kind of analogy for the Three Sisters of the plants. But I do think that for me, that's important. And that can be different for someone. Some people need someone in their Three Sisters who's very encouraging. So I think it is a little bit of self-reflection about what you need as an individual, and then ensuring that you have people that can give that to you. But the part about the Three Sisters critical is that there always has to be reciprocity, and you have to understand what you can give back. And that's how you sustain those relationships for the long term.
That's so wonderful. And I took that from the book, the discussion both about plants being decision makers within an environment, also contributing to changing the environment and interacting with other plants.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. We have a question here from a woman who did a thesis on Black women who created communal gardens post-emancipation and in the South, and how that reduced lynchings and improved community cohesion. And the question is, are there ways that we can partner with you? Are you, I can't say more than that. That's what it says.
Okay. Well, it's so funny because I was writing, first of all, I don't know who this woman is, but I need her to reach out to me because I'm fascinated by that thesis topic. But yeah, so, I mean, a lot of the work that I do, much of the work that has developed in terms of the plant work that I do has come through deep conversations and sometimes collaboration. So I have a project going on now that's at the interface of plant biology and African American history. And so I have paired with people who do some work in terms of work in, it was pre-emancipation actually, and the contributions that enslaved people brought to agriculture and those kinds of things. So I certainly do connect with people. A lot of those connections have happened kind of serendipitously. I've collided with people on Twitter or other places, but yeah, I would love to hear from her, others who have things that are of interest.
Great. Here's an interesting question that brings in the topic of climate change to this broader conversation. What would be your take on the idea that climate change may be a representation of the global racial justice movement, the sort of connection there between climate change and the racial justice movement?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about that question in so many different ways because excuse me, I think there are obvious connections that people already see between climate change and racial injustice in terms of, the work that people do in environmental justice, who lives in areas that have been most impacted by some things that are escalated by climate change. So I have a lot of colleagues and friends who live in coastal areas, and certainly flooding and other things have been impacted by climate change. And a lot of time, the land that's most at risk is the land that's available to people who can't afford to live elsewhere. So I think there are already these interactions between how racism and economic disparities show up in our space that intersect with climate change already. I'm sure that there are more, not just, I'm thinking about real connections. There are probably more analogies around that as well. One of the things that I think about in terms of climate change and the kinds of thoughts that I have about plants is that plants are well adapted to deal with natural patterns of ecological change. The issue with climate change is that frequently it causes the change faster than the plants can catch up. And so that's when we see plants and other animals going extinct. And so when I think about those kinds of aspects of climate change, I think that disparities, we see similar things. And one of the reasons that COVID and coronavirus hit some communities, racial and ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups harder than others is because they couldn't keep up with the pace fast enough. Those of us who had enough money had time to set up a home office, set up a home gym, to set up the entire life we needed so that we basically didn't have to leave our homes. We could even order in groceries. But if you're disadvantaged in a way that you can't keep pace with change that's needed to keep you safe, racism can interact with any number of biological traits. And I think that that's part of the reason that our systems, that's when we see those inequities coming to the forefront and coming to bear in those kinds of ways.
Yes. There's a question here about soil fungi and the role that they play in influencing the flavor of plants that are.
Oh, what a fun question. I thought that question was going somewhere else because of the role of fungi in mycorrhizae and the fact that I had released an article maybe today about mycorrhizae. But yeah, so fungi have these really interesting impacts on plants. So from everything as to whether the plants grow better because the fungi associate with the roots and increase their ability to take up nutrients in water, but certainly the biochemistry and chemical reactions that happen in fungi can in some ways reprogram what we think of as the secondary metabolism of plants. And in that way, different compounds can be produced in the presence of fungi than in their absence. And certainly this is something that happens in natural context, but people who are paying attention to that can indeed use their knowledge about that to change flavor profiles of certain things in plants for sure. It's a fascinating, I'm fascinated by the ways in which, certain things like bacteria and fungi can completely reprogram what's going on in terms of the chemistry of plants. So
that's pretty cool. I have a question. As an academic, knowing that our audience here is probably composed of academics and lots of non-academics in industry, government, and nonprofits, and thinking about your reflections obviously are from the perspective of yourself as an academic, and ways in which you translated your work and understanding about plants to an academic organization where our role is education and mentoring and student development and research. Are there particular aspects of that that translate to other kinds of organizations? Is it essentially the same idea, or are there other unique takes on that for other kinds of organizations?
Yeah, I think, the mentoring, I think, is the thing that's most parallel across different organizations. So I've done a lot of work around leadership and mentoring consultations in the private sector, in the federal government with the National Reserve and others. And I think the mentoring is one that translates quite easily across because it is about how we support people. There are sometimes adaptations that have to be made because all of this is happening much like plant growth in a climate, and climates are different in business than in academia. I think that one of the things that's sometimes it's easier to do this work outside of academia. Academia, particularly some areas like the sciences, have this really strange kind of composition where, and I learned this a lot in academia when I was working with sociologists and historians and others, in the sciences, the way we mentor people is so tightly connected to our own success that sometimes it's hard to just tell them what they need to do, because if I tell them what they need to do and the paper doesn't get published fast, it affects my career. So in some other spaces, there are sometimes not as intertwined success outcomes. And so I find that doing this work in some spaces, the things that are much different is doing leadership work in academia versus the private sector. And that's because in the private sector, in ways that are very different in academia, it's often linked to a bottom line. And so when you're talking to leaders about making decisions, if they don't see the connection to the bottom line, it's hard to get them to implement certain things. In academia, quite to be just blunt, we're worried about prestige and ranking, and we have to keep enough money to keep everything going, but it's not the same bottom line as it is in other spaces. So there are some unique kinds of ways in which you have to understand what drives people and to translate it into ways that they see that connection. But under the core, the principles are quite similar.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have reached the end of the questions. If there are any more, feel free to go ahead and add them. We are also reaching the end of our time. So I don't want to belabor or just tread water here. So I think it probably makes sense to go ahead and end the session and offer you our thanks, offer our thanks to all the folks who participated and asked questions, and to our co-sponsors at PRISM, and wish you all a good evening. It's a beautiful evening here in Seattle. Hope it is in East Lansing too.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.